이른 아침에 이렇게 많이 나와주셔서 대단히 감사합니다. 우리 관례대로 영어로 제가 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is so nice to see you all at this very early hour. For obvious reasons, we all are very much interested in what's happening in China. We are particularly interested in the Chinese leadership change and its policy priorities and the national agenda. Already, there have been substantial media coverage on this Chinese leadership, new leadership. In fact, this morning, this International Herald Tribune has the long coverage on Zhang Gaoli and his stance on the economic policy and so forth. But this morning, we are very fortunate to have the leading the analyst and the expert on the Chinese economy. In fact, he is the renowned scholar and practitioner and policymaker in the field of global finance, and particularly the Asian finance, Dr. Andrew Sheng, who is based in Hong Kong, and he's heading the 펑글로벌연구원장, which is a private think tank in Hong Kong. At the same time, he is actively engaged in consulting international financial institutions. In fact, he is currently chief advisor to China's banking regulatory commission, and at the same time, as I said, he's on advisory board of many the Chinese financial institutions and the financial institutions in Asia, including Malaysia and so forth. He also teaches at the Tsinghua University. So he used to work for World Bank and the advising other central banks in East Asia, in Southeast Asia. So he has written many books and many articles in this area. So I'm sure he will share his enlightening views regarding the new leadership and China's policy priorities and major challenges facing the leadership. With this and with no further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Sheng, and please join me in welcoming Dr.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yusakong. Dr. Il is my person I admire most in Korean economics, but in this field, every one of you are real experts. Just in being introduced this morning, I realized that I'm going to take an examination today. This time early in the morning, I cannot think properly because Dr. Yusakong is such a hard worker. I have to get up to this morning to do my homework. And of course, I'm 1 hour ahead 1 hour behind in Hong Kong time. So my clock is not working very properly. But so my job is to entertain you for about 1 hour And I want to say that, this is a subject that I need to declare that I'm not a political scientist. I am, just like you, I'm an observer of China. And of course, today China is a very, very hot topic. If you go to the blogs, you would see that probably 1 in 5, something like 40%, is very concentrated on what's happening in China. And so everybody's very keen on this new leadership. Now, this is the year of the dragon. So I just want to make sure that you all understand this is my personal views. I don't represent any institution in what I'm saying today. This is the year of the dragon. There are many changes that are going on, as you can see. Many surprises. French presidency has changed. Recently there's American elections, now the Chinese leadership, and I understand there's going to be a presidential election also in this country. So many changes are happening, and even in Japan there's, elections. So, the year of the dragon generally is a year of change. And the topic that Dr. Il has asked me to talk about is new leadership in China and the policy changes. And one of my friends here asked me how much I'm going to talk about the new leadership. I said I've only got 7 slides out of 60, so I was going to talk more about the policy changes than about the new leadership. But I understand you're more interested in what's happening in the new leadership. So I just want to say that what I think is going to happen, now don't believe me if I may be wrong, is going to be very steadfast sailing in very turbulent seas. That's the theme that I want to say. Okay, and the new leadership is actually a very tested team dedicated towards reform. Now, there are newspaper articles you see, oh, this is a very conservative team, less reform-minded. I don't think that's right. This is a very tested team, and I'll explain why. Now, the first, of course, is Mr. Xi Jinping. He's 59 years old. He's son of a tested reformer. He has worked in Fujian and let me see, three very major areas: Fujian, Zhejiang, and Shanghai, before he was promoted to become vice president. And as you know, he was selected as the heir, that means the person who to succeed as Secretary General and President 5 years ago. So this is very different from other areas where you get elected and then you immediately within 1 or 2 months become official. He knew he was going to become president and Secretary General 5 years ago, and when he became vice president. Now he is unusual because his father was purged 3 times during the Mao period, and even during the Deng period, he also had to leave government. So he himself was very much worked outside Beijing and learned things the hard way. He's known to be he looks sort of short, but he's actually over 7 foot tall. And he is well known for being very self-confident, very affable. That means personal relations very, very good. And he actually can speak off the cuff. He's less stiff than the present person he's succeeding. And he is a conciliator. That means he works with people. Okay? And of course, when he was sent to Fujian, he handled the corruption cases, anti-corruption cases, against one of the biggest cases during that period. Now, I want to quote something he said, because this is the theme of what sets the tone of this period. What is the policy changes facing China? And let me quote. Our people have ardent love for life. They wish to have better education, more stable jobs, more income, greater social security, better medical and health care, improve housing conditions, and a better environment. They want their children to have sound growth, have good jobs, and lead a more enjoyable life. To meet their desire for a happy life is our mission. Now he's speaking, of course, to the party congress, right? So what is the mission of the party? And I think this part is very worthwhile quoting. He said, but we are not complacent and we will never rest on our laurels. He was talking about the period, about how the success of the last 10 years. And he said, under the new conditions, our party faces many severe challenges, and there are also many pressing problems within the party that need to be resolved, particularly corruption, taking bribes, being divorced from the people, going through formalities and bureaucracy caused by some party officials. So very clearly, anti-corruption is one of his major tasks. Now his team, I'm showing this in the order. It's very important that you know the order. Premier Li is the youngest of them all. He's 57 years old. He was the youngest provincial governor when he was appointed the governor of Henan. He will succeed as the premier in March 2013, next year. He is the first member of the standing committee to have a doctorate in economics. The present team is almost 100% engineers. I mean, the present standing committee is almost 100% engineers, and this time round, this is the first doctorate in economics. Now, he comes from the youth faction. He's very, very young. And he worked as a party official until he became Henan governor for quite some while. Then he moved on to Liaoning province, which is quite close, North China. And then in 2007, he became vice premier. And vice premier in charge of Ministry of Finance, the finance portfolio, and the housing portfolio. So, including the medical reforms. Now, this is the division of labor currently between him and the executive vice, not the executive vice premier. He is currently executive vice premier. That means the second after the Wen Jiabao. And he looks after Ministry of Finance, and whereas Wang Qishan, who is much more well known to the people involved in finance and trade, looks after trade and finance portfolio and the U.S.-China relationships. So, currently Vice Premier Li is very young, low-key, actually speaks very, very good English, compared to the others. But, by the way, President Xi, or the forthcoming President Xi, has a very good understanding of English. And his wife is, his daughter actually is studying at Harvard University. Number 3 is going to be the chairman of the National People's Congress, Zhang Dejiang. He is currently the party secretary in charge of Chongqing, who took over from Bo Xilai, who has become disgraced. He is currently vice premier, but he was vice premier in charge of industry and energy. He actually worked in Liaoning, which is the one that Li Keqiang was. But he's very unusual because he studied at Pyongyang University in Kim Il-sung University. So he's one of the few to have studied economics in North Korea. And then he moved to become also in Zhejiang province. Now, that means he was actually the provincial party head, the head of the Zhejiang province, before Xi Jinping became. So he's actually very close also to Mr. Xi Jinping. So these are some of the connections that you need to particularly understand. And he's very tested, very known to be very bright, and a very good hand. Now, the chairman of the National People's Congress traditionally is number 2 in the hierarchy. Okay, the fourth is Mr. Eugene Zhengsheng, who is going to be the president of the Chinese People Political Consultative Committee, which is the equivalent of the Senate. He is probably the oldest at 67 years old. He's actually trained as an engineer. He worked in Qingdao, which again the north part. Then worked in Shandong, which is a very large province opposite, across the sea from Korea, and then became party secretary in Shanghai. So very well known again as a conciliator, a moderate, but a very reform-minded person, very much trusted. Then Mr. Liu Yinsan, who is going to become the vice president. He's 65 years old. He's basically been in the party, but worked in Inner Mongolia and been in charge of the media and the propaganda department. Then this is the most probably well-known to many people engaged in finance, Mr. Wang Qishan, who everybody thought maybe about 6-7 months ago that he would become the executive vice premier in charge of the economics and the finance reform, etc. He is very well known as a crisis manager. He helped clean up the JITIC, the Guangdong Investment Trust, in 1997-98. He worked in the Reform Commission, studied history, very much a philosopher, very articulate, very charismatic, been in charge of the finance portfolio since 2007. And before that, he helped manage the Beijing Olympics. He sorted out the SARS crisis, and known to be a person with a very, very sure hand. He is now in charge of the disciplinary commission, which is actually, the anti-corruption. So a very tested, tried person in charge of the anti-corruption area. And the last of the seventh, but not the least, in order, is going to be the executive vice premier, Zhang Gaoli. I have not read the International Herald Tribune article, but he is actually from the West, less known, but actually a very tried technocrat. He grew up in Fujian, which he comes from the coastal area, but he spent his career in Guangdong, which is the equivalent of the California of China, one of the largest provinces and the most successful. He then became party secretary in Shenzhen. And then from Shenzhen, he moved on to Shandong, again the coastal area, been very, very successful there. And then recently was the party secretary in Tianjin and was in charge of the Bohai development. So this is a really tested reformer. All these people have been tested in the area of practically how to reform. And so this is, in my view, a very strong team. Now, some people may have thought that, oh yes, there are two more. Why is it almost all of them are over, except for Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Li Keqiang, who are under 60. All the others are over 64, 65, which means that in the next 5 years, they would have to step down at the 19th Party Congress. And that's true, but there are 2, 3, or 4 more much younger technocrats waiting in the wings, of which the most well-known ones are Mr. Wang Yang, who is currently the party in charge of Guangdong, and then Mr. Liu Yanchao, who used to be in charge of the personnel side of it. So these are very younger, tested people, all coming up very, very fast. So, let me just stop here to talk about the leadership and then move on to the policy challenges. Now, what China really faces today, and they have inherited, this team has inherited probably, you can say, the glorious 10 years of double-digit growth. Okay? 10 years in which the GDP has increased almost 5 times larger than it was maybe 10 years ago. The foreign exchange went from 300 billion to 3 over trillion. China moved from 6th largest economy to the second largest economy. Mobile phones now is half a billion. So China has completely transformed since 10 years, and there's major reforms also in the last 20 years. So since 1979. Now the issue is that I was telling my friends at the main table that growth is really about demographics and governance, right? Because it's really about the population growth. As the population moves into a working age, there is a suddenly, acceleration. Provided the governance, that means the political system is stable and there's effective support in this area. And I will talk about this later. But it's now clearly facing a secular slowdown because the whole world is slowing down, as we all know. But China itself probably cannot sustain this 8 to 12% growth and needs to slow down to around the 7.5% level. So the GDP, as you can see, do we have a pointer, a laser pointer at all? No. But anyway, you can see that the signs are generally moving towards a slowdown, right? From 2000 all the way up to 2008, the crash, sharp drop, fiscal response, 4 trillion response stimulus, and then it rose back again, and now slowing down again, and then the general trend is downwards. The balance of payments has moved from a surplus, current account surplus, as much as 10% of GDP, and now going back down towards roughly to somewhere between 2.7, 2.8% of GDP. So the imbalance with the America is less of a major trait. The interest rates is a major area. Interest rate liberalization will be a major reform issue, and can talk about that later. The stock market bubble went up to just before the crash to 6,000 points, and today is around 2,000. The slow growth is got still ample fiscal space. Why I stress ample fiscal space is that current GDP debt to GDP ratio is roughly 40%, and compared with the advanced countries of around 100% of GDP. So there is enough space for the government to actually stimulate the economy if necessary. The question is, the Chinese policymakers are now much more cautious about stimulus at this stage. And if you look at the government budget line, the inflation has gone up quite a bit, and is expected to go under control. Budget deficit in 2012 is about 2.6% of GDP, which is still manageable, and current account deficit is around 2.8, 2.7%. So it's basically now all this. The main policies are already set in the 12th five-year plan, which is from 2011 to 2015. So we are already in the second year of the 12th five-year plan. What does the second 12th five-year plan say? It says exactly what Mr. Xi Jinping said. The Chinese people now want a better life, want better health care, want better environment, less corruption, etc. So the plan actually goes for inclusive growth. Now, I want to congratulate my Korean friends for, I think it's a very visionary the 5-year green growth plan, because I think that is very innovative. But that's exactly also where China is heading, except that it has not been articulated that way. So the economic development will be around 7% growth, which is very significant because the previous plan said 8%, but they achieved more than 8%. So when they say 7%, they mean to be conservative, sending a signal. And the reason why the central government says 7 and the local governments want more, because the local governments get promoted if they do better. So there is an inherent incentive at the lower level to have faster growth. Now, there are some problems in terms of the exact numbers, because the provincial numbers all add up much higher than the national average. So some of the issues need to be, the statistics need to be interpreted with some caution. But the general direction is fairly clear. Now, there is, it needs to restructure the economy, and speed up urbanization, especially urbanization. China last year crossed the 50% line. When China embarked on reform, the rural population was 3/4. The urban population was only 1/4. Last year, Chinese population hit 50%, urban population, right? In 20 years' time, it will reach 70%. Okay? That means, the basic policy is to concentrate in the urban areas and push the urban development. So there's 4% urban expansion of urbanization annually, and 4% of the service sector. You look at the service sector, it's only 47% of GDP, 43% currently, right? Which is very small compared to advanced countries. Korea, I think, if I'm not wrong, is already reaching, past the 70% level, and then advanced economies, service economies, around 80%. Now, it's focusing on education and scientific development, trying to push up R&D. It is going towards well-being and livelihood, and they want to double the per capita income by 2020, right? Which means that, over the last few years, there's recognition that per capita GDP has been too low. Real wages in the 5-year plan is scheduled to increase 13% per year over the 5 years. So that's why wages in China are increasing, and you can see a little spike in that inflation. And then to emphasize green growth, there is a major attempt at sorting out the pollution issues and the carbon emission issues. And I truly believe that China will fulfill these targets, because one thing is for sure, once they put their mind to it, they will address it, very, very well. Now, I want to do a slightly longer analysis, because, a short term doesn't give you, and there was recent World Bank and the Development Research Center of the State Council. And I want to quote Mr. Wen Jiabao himself, the President Premier, in 2007, when he said that China's economic model is unsustainable, uncoordinated, unbalanced, and unstable. So, this is as frank as you can get about the challenges facing this new team. The growth has been very impressive. I don't need to tell you about it. The contribution to real GDP growth is very interesting. If you look at the blue line, that's the exports. In the past, the exports have some contribution, and in 2009, 2010, and even currently, broadly equal. The major contribution is that red line, which has been flat, and then the green line, which is the fixed capital investment. And the Chinese economy is best understood using Minsky. Minsky is the right disciple of Keynes, who said profit comes from investments, and growth comes from investments, which drives profits, which drives growth. Okay? It's not a consumption-led theory. It's actually an investment-led theory. Now, the question then is, how big is that investment issue? Now, the broad picture is that there is no doubt in everybody's mind that with the advanced economy slowing, emerging markets will lead the growth to 2030. This is the World Bank study, and I won't go into detail. The problem is that the Chinese capital output ratio, the investment, is high, the output is less. But because investment can be as high as 50% of GDP, if you get a 10-12%, it's more like 4 to 1. Whereas in India, for example, they invest nearly a quarter of GDP, but they also get a 7-8% growth. So, to a large extent, to what extent is that investment efficient is a very key issue. But that investment quality, needs to be improved, and everybody understand that. Now, this is a very interesting chart, and I think I want to show this because a lot of people say, oh, China is over-investing. This is the capital investment per capita, okay, in 2011 prices, and the blue line is China, the green is India, the beige, the yellow or ochre that shows here is Japan, and the red one is USA. Look at how low China is. Right? So China can double their investment, then the per capita will still be very low compared to Japan, compared to the United States. So, short term, yes, you will see some buildings empty, some cities look empty, but China is building the infrastructure for the next generation. China is building housing that has as good quality as many advanced countries with middle income, but the income for the workers still relatively low. So now the economic strategy is to increase the income of the average people. Okay? So that needs to be distributed more fairly. So this chart shows you that the potential for investment within China is still very large. And yes, there may be short-term, spurts, etc., but that is the key. Now, the real reason is that it's still on the high growth path, but it will begin to slow because of the Lewis turning point. Now, the Lewis turning point means that, Sir William Arthur Lewis is a Nobel laureate. He's a West Indian. He wrote a very famous book in the 1950s which says that, for emerging markets, in the early period, you will have very low wages because you have lots of surplus labor from the agricultural sector. At some time in the development, you will have a turning point. That means the surplus labor is gone. Your demand for labor is higher than the supply, and then your wages will begin to increase. And China has already reached that stage. Okay, original people thought maybe 5-10 years away, but actually it's already reached that particular point. Now, it's facing both cyclical and secular slowdown. As I said, when you actually reach a very high level, you cannot sustain that 8, 9, 10% growth. Because the 10% growth means that in 7 years you double your GDP, right? It's a rule of 72. Now, the slowdown is inevitable because you can see the investment to GDP ratio, this is according to the Chinese and the World Bank calculations, will move from nearly half to 1/3. The consumption ratio will move from half to over 2/3, right? And the industry ratio will go down and the services will go up to about 60% of GDP. I'm sorry if you can't see this in detail. And the big trouble is that manufacturing is still dominant over services. And you can see this. You can be very good in manufacturing, but actually value added doesn't exist. I mean, that is very, very small. So the best example is the ADB study on the iPod study, in which they said that the Chinese value added in the iPod is only 4%, whereas the bulk of it is attributes to the United States. And so if you calculate on value-added purposes, the U.S.-China trade is very, very, very different. So it's very clear that it needs to move ahead. Now, the major problem is clearly the income inequality, right? And in the last 3 decades, the personal income growth has fallen behind economic growth. And that clearly is not fair, because if personal income falling behind GDP, the low wage is losing out. And that's why there's a firm policy to double the income per capita. Now, here is the big challenge. Where is the new growth going to come from? Right? And everybody talks about the middle income trap. And of course, China and India are both in that level. Once you reach the middle income, how do you come out of it? And the best example of getting out of the middle income trap is this country, right? Korea has done very, very well, and China has, and other middle income countries has, a lot to learn from Korea. And that means that you have to move up the services area, move up knowledge area, improve your productivity, devote more to R&D, move towards internal consumption, etc. So, this green line that's going up, that broke out of the middle income trap, is basically Korea, and the other line above is Japan. So Japan broke out of middle income trap in the 1960s. Korea broke out of it in the 1990s. But there are also pollution issues, right? The sharp problem is income and asset inequality, low consumption, and high environmental costs. Air quality in China is a serious issue. And this chart, this is mine, taken from the International Energy Statistics, and it goes to show how much the carbon dioxide, the CO2 emissions in China is. And a lot of that is due to the coal usage, which has high emission, and that's something that China needs to deal with. Now, part of the problem in China with high property prices is due to the fiscal federalism problem. Fiscal federalism means how much revenue should the central government get and how much should the local government get. And you can see that local government responsible for 80% of the expenditure, and they get 40% of their revenue from the central government. And the reason is partly political. The central government is very cautious to allow the local government to overdo it. Okay? And the Chinese have a saying, if you control, everything stops. If you let go, everything becomes chaotic. Okay? So there is this tension between the center and the local governments. The local governments want to go faster. The central government says, macro stability, you need to control it. And unfortunately, the macroeconomic tools, such as monetary policy and fiscal policy, is less effective. So in the late 80s, when I was working in the World Bank, working on China, there used to be a joke that Chinese macro policy was an accelerator and a brake and nothing in between, right? So that it was very difficult to fine-tune the economy. And I think this is by and large still true, and the reason it is a very large economy. Large economies, once it starts moving, is very difficult to slow, and once it slows, it's very difficult to accelerate. Okay? So fine-tuning is very difficult in very large economies. And this gives you an idea of how much the average. So for example, in OECD countries, sub-provincial share of government revenues is 19%. In China, it's 34%. Sub-provincial share of government expenditure is 32%. In China, is 60%. So this is clearly a division. Now, what about the external imbalance? I don't worry too much about the external imbalance, because I think that what people didn't understand, and a lot of people say is the exchange rate, etc. It's never about the nominal exchange rate. It's always about the real effective exchange rate. Now, those of you who studied economics, the Samuelson Balassa, would know that actually, if you fix the exchange rate at a nominal at a certain level, the domestic inflation, etc., adjusts, and that the real effective exchange rate then begins to adjust. Okay? So in China, what happened in the first decade of the 21st century, that means 2000 to 2010, was that they benefited from the reforms in the last decade of the 1990s. The decade before made very important reforms in the SOE area and in the state enterprise area and in the government revenue area, the tax area. What then happened was the lag impact. The household savings in China actually maintained very stable, did not change very much. The current account, as you know, is the reflection of the net savings in the economy. And the net savings are basically three: household savings, corporate savings, and government savings. Okay? So what happened is that if the household savings was stable, the SOE reforms, the privatization of the very small state-owned enterprises gave the economy a productivity boost. Remove inefficiency of the state-owned enterprises, improve the enterprise sector by privatization. And then the reconsolidation and restructuring of state-owned enterprises, the biggest savers became the large state-owned enterprises. So in the last decade, the savings of the corporate sector rose very sharply. At the same time, as the economy began to grow, the tax reforms enabled, for the first time in Chinese history, in the recorded 2,000 years, the Chinese government began to have a fiscal, a primary surplus. And so the savings of the public sector and the savings of the SOE, the corporate sector, right, caused the current account to rise to 10% of GDP. Now, that is clearly not sustainable, and what you have now seen is that as the fiscal, moves into deficit, moves towards deficit, the SO enterprises' profitability goes down, the current account actually also begins to go down. So I think, you need to understand not just from the looking at just at the exchange rate issue, but look at the internal dynamics of the savings issue. So what is the major real growth push is the real GDP is the blue line. The red line is this friend of mine, he calls it the Li Keqiang Index. He's looking at the real credit growth, including shadow lending, railway volume, and electricity consumption. And you can see that the real index, it tracks the industrial profits quite well. So as industrial profits rose, GDP takes a little perk. As industrial profits go down, GDP tends to go down a little bit. Now, this chart shows about the population and the labor force peaking. Now, it's already actually flattening. If you really look at this area, the labor force has moved up. It peaked 2015. So the labor force is already peaking. And thereafter, exactly like, Japan, the labor force will begin to decline. Right? So, so China, because of the one-child policy, will also begin to face the impact of slower growth and the decline of the labor force. Now, of course, everything really ultimately depends upon total factor productivity, and therefore depends upon R&D in innovation, efficiency of fixed capital investment, etc. But there is also a very serious problem of natural resource depletion and serious environmental pollution. And if you look at the degradation as percentage of national income, China, India is very high, Brazil is also very high, US is 2%, and Korea is less than 0.5, 0.6%. So Korea, Japan, and Germany are very efficient, whereas the others have been much more depletive. And the environmental natural resource depletion as percentage of GDP around 9+%, compared with less than 2% for Korea and Japan. And so therefore, China needs to have the net improvement. And this World Bank chart basically says it is possible, just like what Korea did. Okay? So it's only a question of political will and determination to get to become more green. And of course, poor urban air quality is a serious issue. And those of you who have visited China would know this. This will have health consequences, in time. So now, the income inequality. The income inequality is a problem. It's a Gini coefficient of 45. It used to be only 30 in 1980, which means that income inequality is worsened. And so the doubling of the per capita income is exactly to address this issue. And there is the question of basic security for all. So in the last year, there's been major pension reform guaranteeing minimum pension for most of the population. The big fear in China is that you grow old before you become rich, right? Countries like Japan has become rich, but it is growing older. So as you grow older, increasingly you will want better health care, better pension rights. And it will move, 60 plus will move from 12% to roughly 1/4 by 2030. So it's a serious issue. And then a very major issue is how to rebalance between the state-owned enterprises and the private enterprises. Now, you can see this chart. It's not true that the state-owned enterprises have become very big. But the state-owned enterprises control the major kind of utilities and therefore are much more monopolistic. So the SOE number of enterprises have gone from 40% down to very low. The employment share is now went from 60% to 20%, and the asset share, but it's still at 50%. You see? So this is what the complaint is about. That the SOE's asset share is 70% in 1998. It's now still 50, 40+%. But the ROE has begun to become declined, whereas the ROE of the non-SOEs is still rising. So clearly, for China to get the efficiency, another round of how to rebalance between the state-owned enterprise and the private sector is a crucial issue. Now, what does sustainable growth really mean? Well, ideally, you want to see it go straight up like that, but in reality, it has. I'm sorry, the line is not clear. You want to move behind the feasible, and if you're not careful, sorry, I beg your pardon. If you're not careful, it becomes highly volatile. So China needs to minimize the boom and bust scenario. It's a very crucial issue. Now, unfortunately, this chart is too complex, but I need to do a little bit of explanation. It's the way I think about it. All right, it's the interaction between the state, the market, and the external forces. Now, this is market. It's becoming bigger in China. The state is still very strong, but ultimately it's all about performance, right? It's all about performance. And so you really need to understand how the state works with the market to get this performance, environment, distribution of income, volatility, production, consumption, values. And that issue is clearly the area that our institute, the Fung Global Institute, is working on. What are we working on? We're working on the real sector, which is the global supply chain. Increasingly, I realize that the real sector is actually about supply chains. I'll explain why. Then on the real side, you have the finance side, which is the risk, the virtual side of this is the asset side, this may be the liability side. And then to control the two is due to governance. How do you manage these two? And ultimately, it's about sustainability, whether we are consuming too much of the natural resources. The issue why we think this is so important is that if the average Chinese and the Chinese and the Indians consume per capita like the Americans and the Europeans, there will be no natural resources left. Okay? So, the environment is clearly a major constraint. And so, for the Chinese to change their model, let us all hope they succeed. Because if they fail, I think we're all in for a little bit of trouble. Now, so I look at we look at the economy in several ways. Firstly, you all know the made in China, the world factory is a production to consumption supply chain. This world factory was built by MNCs and SMEs. In Korea, it's built by chaebols, right? But to succeed, it needs a logistics supply chain. The logistics supply chain, the infrastructure and transport networks, mostly driven by SOEs. That supply chain needs to be financed, and it's financed by state banks, essentially, and by foreign banks. But for this to succeed, at every point is the government services supply chain. And this is the institutional innovation that the Chinese have brought to the table. Now, this country, Korea, is actually very successful in this, but it has never been explained, as far as I know. Okay? But we all know that every stage of that supply chain, the government is involved in licensing, in permits, health, quality control, property rights disputes, customs, tariffs, taxes, financial regulation, etc. How you make that succeed is very, very crucial. And that is in what China is called the 顶层设计, which means top-down governance architecture. Okay? Because what it controls is this. If you really look at it, what happens is that there is a top-level governance that controls the executive. It controls the executive, legislature, and judiciary, and it's about policy formulation, policy implementation, and policy outcome. Right? And it is about people, planet, and profits, business. Okay? It is about political economy, economic efficiency, stability, and sustainability. So how do you manage that is not an ism, is how you do it. So that's why I said, you need to look at this very carefully. Now, what we do now, and I just want to do a little bit explanation how we study this, is that we need to study how the supply chain is changing. The supply chain is changing because in the past, the Japanese started it. They produced, made in Japan, sell to America, sell to Europe. When they got rich, they moved the production to the 4 dragons, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, right? When these 4 dragons got rich, it moved to the 4 tigers, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines. And when these got expensive, moved to China, right? So, there was this supply chain shift. But today, the advanced country, which are the major market, is saying, I want value added, where my profits are, but I also want jobs. Now, here is the dilemma. Previously, it was cheap in Asia, and then it is sold to the expensive market. But people forget, technology is changing the game. As you can see from Foxconn, a large part of the iPad can be made totally by robots. Right? So if you say you want to move the production back to America, it can also be made by robots. Does it create jobs? It doesn't create jobs. So the supply chain itself is changing. It's changing not just from east to west, but now increasingly, as you can see from the container ships, from west back to the east. It will be much more within the south-south, north-south, east-west, west-east, within the emerging markets. The policy factors are changing, the natural resources are changing, the technology itself is changing, and the tastes are changing. So we need to study this. And therefore, we need to study how that value chain is going, and therefore this country has a lot of lessons. You move up the value chain. You have to move up towards education, right? Legal institutions. You're no longer cheap labor as such, okay? And you need to have the proximity to the market, design, etc. So it is a very major challenge. Our second project is about the finance. What should Asian finance be like? There is one big lesson after this crisis. Finance must serve the real sector. Now, this is pretty important because, this crisis exposed the two sides of finance. One side is finance is an engine of growth. It helps to create jobs, value, equity. The other one is an engine of bubble. Right? And if we are not careful, Asian finance, if we only copy the Wall Street model, it could be another engine of bubble. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it that over the last 30, 40 years, Asian institutions, financial institutions, have not been able to emulate the equivalence of the Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, etc.? Right? Why is it that our stock markets have not been very major capital fundraisers for small and medium enterprises? Why is it that our banking system has difficulty lending to trade finance, small and medium enterprises, and finance infrastructure? Okay? And then you need to ask yourself, why is it that we are implementing Basel III, which is designed for the advanced markets, in which the Americans are saying we're postponing, the Europeans says we are rethinking, the UK is saying too complex, and we are eating a medicine for which we don't have the disease yet. Right? So, there are issues that we need to think very clearly out. Now, I support the principles behind Basel III because I'm a former financial regulator, but I need to ask myself, is this the right medicine for Asia if we need to grow? Because if the Basel III arrangements slow down global growth, including slowing down in Asia, we will synchronically go into a recession globally. Is that what is the intention of these regulations? The regulation is a means to an end, not an end to itself, right? The regulation is to help us grow and become more prosperous. It is not to say you must be very cautious, because we know no risk, no gain. It's how you manage that risk issue. So if you now, let me go back very quickly to the Chinese 12 five-year plan, the financial sector reform. It's aiming towards making the finance more responsive to the real sector, improving resource allocation, global competitiveness, inclusive growth, and improved safety net. Now, if you look at these numbers, I'm sorry the numbers are relatively small, but look at the banking institutions. The banking institutions, 240%, let me see, what is the size here? If I'm not wrong, that's size per GDP, if I'm not wrong. Whereas the insurance assets is very small relative to the banks. The securities companies are much, much smaller. The bonds outstanding is only 28%, financial bonds 15%, corporate bonds 8.6%, and stock market 66.7%. So by and large, the financial system is still very much bank dominated. Okay. Now, the banking system has become less concentrated. It used to be state-owned banks 58%, now down to 49%. The joint stock banks have improved 5 percentage points. So it's become less concentrated, but foreign participation is still relatively small. And China needs to address the financial repression. The internationalization is gradual, and then the key questions we will answer, specifically when I have the chance. Now, the third project is the emerging growth model. And the emerging growth model is really about governance. And how we studied it in the Fung Global Institute is to compare China and India. Because China and India together is 40% of mankind. So whether they succeed or not in their 12 five-year plan, both countries have 12 five-year plans. The Indian is from 2012 to 2016. The Chinese 2011 to 2015. Now, basically they're all trying to catch up. They're trying to catch up with the United States, right? And, the issue is what are the institutional and policy stumbling blocks and what is the role of the state versus the market. And the final project is about sustainable development. Basically, we're looking at how can we grow without destroying our environment. That's essentially the key issue, and it's about the compromise between economic environment and the social imbalance. So this is the study, why we need to do this. Now, in the Fung Global Institute, that's what we do. We try to convene everybody to talk about this, and when Dr. Ilsa Kong invited me, I thought it's very important that I engage with my Korean friends, because we need to have better debate within Asia about our own future. We need to think more carefully. Dr. Ilsa Kong was the Sherpa for G20. G20 has been extremely important, but for Asia to have more input into G20, we need to think more about the problems for ourselves. And it's a very, very important issue that we need to do. Now, we have our top leadership, Dr. Victor Fung, who is a leading businessman in Hong Kong, Nobel laureate Michael Spence, and Lord Nicholas Stern, Richard Wong from Hong Kong, Arthur Kleinman from Harvard, Xiaogang, my colleague, Patrick Loh, who is from WTO chief economist, and Don Lessard from MIT, and Pamela Ma in charge of our financial area. So let me stop here, and I'll leave the time for questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for very, very comprehensive and penetrating the presentation on the Chinese new leadership and the policy challenges and future outlook. With this, since time is rather limited, I would invite some of the comments and questions from the floor, and make your point as short as possible. Yes, Dr. An and Dr. Kim, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sheng. Really very comprehensive and insightful presentation. Although you have not really covered intra-regional cooperation matters, China vis-a-vis the rest of Asia, and especially China vis-a-vis the United States. First, I have two questions with respect to Korean Peninsula issues. You mentioned that Zhang Dezhang and Yu Sheng, one trained at Kim Il-sung University and who served also Shandong area. Seems to me they are very familiar with the Korean Peninsula issues, simply geographically neighboring state. My question is that how the new leadership in China view Korean Peninsula issue, and how the new leadership will see the North Korea and South Korea, the bilateral relationship. To what extent the new leadership can influence North Korea to tame the global order or some sort of the peaceful coexistence with the South Korea. Second question, although you have not mentioned that at the moment China, Japan, and Korea are going to begin the tripartite trade negotiation within this year, and also simultaneously ASEAN summit, East Asian regional collaboration movement is also going on. United States also pushing through a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, so on and so on. So in this regard, how China is going to position in terms of the intra-regional trade, the relationship with the Asian neighbors and with the U.S. What priority are there? You think this China, Japan, Korea free trade agreement can go on given the territorial conflict between China and Japan? Thank you.
Okay, maybe collect a few more. Yes, Dr. Kim, please. Yes, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sheng. I'd like to ask two questions. First, the political leadership of China. As you pointed out, there are 2 new men under 50, and the rest of the 5 will fade out after 5 years. The formation of this particular Politburo took more time than in any time in the past, indicating there was a lot of discussions in the back. And I would like to ask your opinion of, is there any trend change in terms of the one-man dictatorship turning increasingly to collective leadership, collective consensus, how these 7 people will make policy decisions, particularly when it comes to economics. Li Keqiang, as you pointed out, is a very competent economist, but in a sense, politically he's isolated. So among the 7 men, Politburo, how the economic policy would be formulated. Second question concerns with the economic development of China and development in overall. First, I think overall the speed of growth, in the past the faster growth was good everywhere. And that was before we talked about external diseconomy. Now increasingly this is a factor particularly with China, as you pointed out, with that size. If they continue to grow without making efficient, it cannot be sustained. So that is an issue. But before we worry about that, you also pointed out the inequality leading to social unrest. And China, the issue I understand is enormous, although it's more, I guess, greater than the reported outside. How would the policy formulation divide the attention between the solving that problem versus growth? Thank you.
Okay. Last, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sheng.
Yes.
You have very interestingly indicated here on state-owned enterprises. As long as I know, on page 41, you have indicated, and later about supply chain related, you made some comparison between SOE and private enterprises or multinational corporations and so on. Among the reform of new leadership team related, how do you foresee which direction would be the reform on SOE? I read some report and so on. Without the reform of SOE, China could be sustainable like past period type of China's growth model. So in that sense, how do you compare previous session and new coming, especially centered on SOE? That's my question. Thank you.
The first one, as I mentioned, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't really study the regional interaction over, the territorial issues or even the bilateral relations. My view is that as long as the Chinese economy is going on a steady path, everybody generally benefits. The question is, the relationship issue is a diplomatic issue outside my expertise. But by and large, I think the view generally within China is that Korea is actually a very, very important example of how you broke out of the middle income trap, how you dealt with the moving up the value-added chain, R&D, green growth. And also, my understanding is that they are also looking at how the political reforms occurred over the last, certainly in the post-war period. So, I think there is much we can all learn from the Korean experience. And my suggestion is that more the Koreans explain within China how Korea managed this transition, the better it is for everybody. That's my answer to you. Now, on the how is policy formulated in this period? The answer to this is that we are entering into a period in the world where nobody knows the answers. In the past, you can say this is okay, that's okay. The theory is a reasonably good guide. Today, we have realized that technology has changed the game. Natural disaster is getting bigger and bigger. Social inequities have reached a certain stage in which, together with social media, has changed the governance. In ways that we need to think about. And this is a problem that's not unique to China. Today, as you know, anything that happens in the world, you go into Twitter, like, dislike, right? And so a lot of policies have got immediate public reaction, and the ability of governments to react to that is much more difficult than in the past. Okay, so policy formulation is going to be not easy, mainly because people are still digesting how to deal with very important trends. And as we all know, we don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East. We don't know what's happened with natural disasters. Out of the blue, suddenly one natural disaster turned out to be very, very large. I mean, and the Fukushima incident created disruptive supply chains, and within the same few months, the Bangkok floods also created disruption in the supply chain. You never dreamt about this before. As somebody found out, 60% of one component for a supply chain comes from one particular factory near Fukushima, and another important component comes from a factory near Bangkok, and they have to dive underwater to go and retrieve the components. So the issues are much more complicated, and policy formulation is very, very difficult. So I think what one needs to understand that there is now collective leadership, that the collective leadership is much more responsive to public needs. I mean, I quoted to you the statement by Mr. Xi Jinping, who basically said what everybody knew, that the public wanted better housing, better life, happier life, lesser pollution, more equality, less corruption. All these are what not just Chinese want, but everybody wants, right? So these are universal issues. But how do you deliver this is a very difficult challenge, right? And one must not forget that, we're dealing with 1.3 billion people. And so to change 1.3 billion people, to even reach this stage in which absolute poverty seems to have been addressed, and now it's relative poverty, is a very major challenge. And this is not just, people tend to forget this. I just made this speech in Chicago. I said, if you're concerned about China, think about this very carefully. In the last century, the world went into 2 world wars because of the rise of 2 countries, only 65 million population, that's Japan, and 70 million for Germany. Okay? This century, we are seeing the rise of China, 1.3 billion, the rise of India, 1.3 billion, the rise of the Muslim population worldwide, 1.6 billion, 1.6 billion, and towards the end of this century, rise of 2 billion Africans. Okay? So, we are seeing a billion-class population moving into middle income. Now, Latin America will also be very, 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 very important, but population growth is still relatively small. But it will be also fairly large towards the end of this century. So, we better hope that this model to shift the consumption away from pure, resource depletion and pollution creating growth to a more greener growth And that's why personally I am a great admirer of the Korean green growth model, because I believe that is the way to go. You really need to think about growth in terms of more green and more equal, right? And I think this area that has a lot of lessons. Now on the SOE reform, I think the SOE reform, you need to appreciate that Mr. Zhang Gaoli is from Shenzhen in Guangdong. Mr. Wang Yang, who is very likely to be promoted vice premier, is currently, this is still speculation, not confirmed, is from Guangdong. And that the Guangdong model, which has been the first of the provinces to move towards more market reforms, may be the experimental way. And that area has been much more market-friendly, much stronger private enterprise, what they call minion enterprise, relative to the state-owned enterprises. So there will be the approach, in my view, will definitely go towards much more market-oriented reforms and less of the weight on the SOE reliance.
Okay, now since we're near to the end of the session, Ambassador.
This has been a wonderful breakfast, not only of food, but of your insightful ideas. I'm sure that everybody here is trying to apply the things that you have explained to their own experiences and businesses. My current job as an ambassador of Panama in Korea focuses almost exclusively on shipping industry, because we have the Panama Canal with a very important amount of trade going through it, because Panama has 9,000 vessels in the world with a Panamanian flag. 1,000 of those 9,000 vessels are owned by Koreans. So my embassy basically deals with those 1,000 vessels that you manufacture here on the south of Korea. So when I listen to you, I try to think all these changes in economy, China, production, trade. If I may ask you, how do you think will impact shipping industry, shipbuilding, logistics, ports, the business of Panama of registering ships under our flag, Panama Canal? Please.
Yeah. Well, I think it can only be good, because in my view, the trade between Asia and Latin America will probably double in the next 2 decades, if not sooner. There is no doubt in my mind that's probably going to be the fastest growing area. So shipping will become still very important. Shipping in the short run is going through a cyclical problem. But in my view, the South-South trade will be a very fast area of growth. So my personal inclination is that shipping will still remain very, very important and has a very, very good future. Now, what class of vehicle, what class of ships, will be very different. That I'm not an expert.
Okay, really last
Thank you, Dr. Sheng. I'm a student from Yale University, and recently the military activities of North Korea around the northern limit line has triggered security concerns, and China and North Korea has historically are in close allies, and I want to know how the relations between China and South Korea will be changed.
Oh, I'm not an expert on politics, as I told you. My view is that I think I personally do not see the North Asia going into any serious problems, because the economic ties are so strong that I personally believe peace will be the solution.
Good message. Yes. Okay. Yeah. With this, I think we have to end. Thank you very much for very, very the eliminating coverage of the Chinese landscape. China being the largest second largest economy in the world, and the largest trading partner, certainly draws our attention. And in fact, global attention is on China now. And you assured us that the Chinese new leadership team is very reform-minded and conciliatory, which is very encouraging for the rest of the world, because this world needs the leadership, and by that leadership, this world needs sufficient enough supply of public goods, and public goods are not in short supply. Free trade environment and financial stability. And so we all expect China exert leadership in the global stage as well. And also of course, Korea has to our own the share of obligation in the global stage. And not just looking up the others lead us. I think we should participate in the leadership exercise, and there are rooms for it. And this is actually based on my personal experience in the G20 summit endeavor. And there are rooms, and we should do our own share. Well, with this, maybe we should let Dr. Sheng go, and then maybe we'll bring him back later as to test whether what he said is true or not.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.